Welcome, bookworms and litterbugs, to the Classic English Literature Podcast. This is the show that gives rhyme its reason. Thank you so much for joining me. Make sure you like, follow, and subscribe so you never miss a minute of the sterling work done here on the interweb's best underground Brit-Lit podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share with you a pet peeve. Student essays that begin with a definition ripped wholesale from a dictionary. I feel an actual existential angst, a deep groaning at the heart of my being, and engage a thorough re-examination of the choices I've made in my life when I pick up a student's paper and the first three words are, according to Webster's. Ugh! We know how to use a dictionary. If we don't understand a word, we'll look it up. And usually it's a word that is only new to the student, but it's in rather common parlance among the educated. Ugh. I know, they're young writers, they're learning the craft. A blank screen is intimidating, it's void and meaningless. They're just grasping for access, and they'll get there with patient guidance. I mention this merely because today's episode opens with a definition. According to Webster's, the word cavalier means, noun, a gentleman trained in arms and horsemanship, a mounted soldier, an adherent of Charles I of England, a lady's escort or dancing partner. Adjective, marked by or given to offhand and often disdainful dismissal of important matters, of or relating to the party of King Charles I of England in his struggles with the Puritans and Parliament, of or relating to the English Cavalier Poets of the mid-17th century. The word first pops up in English in the 1580s or so, and derives from the Latin cavalarius, meaning horseman. From this we get words like cheval, cavalry, chivalry. I'm sure most of you know what cavalier means and aren't laughing as much as I'd like at the crude irony of my complaining about using definitions and then using one. It seemed like comedy gold at the time. Anyway, I do bring it up because today's episode about a group of writers in the mid-17th century, now called the Cavalier Poets, will draw on all of the definitions quoted above. Courtly gentlemen, mounted aristocrats fighting in defense of the Caroline monarchy who wrote light verse of a particularly frilly type. I've heard rumors that one wag says they're called the Cavalier Poets because their poetry is simple enough to be written while you fall off the back of a horse. I cannot trace the source of this mordancy. If you can, please write your answer on the back of a $20 bill and send it to me here at the clubhouse. But before we look at some of their representative verse, perhaps I should fill in a thumbnail history of what used to be called the English Civil War, but is now often referred to as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Some historians see these as synonymous terms, others that the Civil War was part of the larger Three Kingdoms War. I'm going to stick with the term Civil War because it's the one I reckon that most listeners will recognize, and besides, I'm a grumpy, intransigent dinosaur. The Royalist faction came to be called the Cavaliers, as opposed to the parliamentary faction called the Roundheads, a pejorative due to their short haircuts. I'll be doing a subcast episode on the writing attendant to these conflicts soon, but for now, here's a brief rundown. It's the 1640s. King Charles I has succeeded his father James on the throne, and he runs things just as you'd expect a spoiled fop would. He can be petulant and self-indulgent, and since God has granted him absolute power, he spends his money like a first-round NFL draft pick with a serious coke problem. Parliament, dominated as it is by Puritans, has had enough of Charles's reckless extravagance and haughty attitude. So, predictably, the crisis starts over money and religion. Charles is perpetually cash-strapped from his lavish tastes, and Parliament acts the stern parent by withholding the checkbook. Charles decides to bypass Parliament and introduces ship money, a tax traditionally only used during wartime, and even then only in coastal towns. But Charles thinks, in for a penny, in for a pound, and taxes everyone, everywhere. History is replete with examples illustrating the popularity of capricious taxation. And let's not forget the God-bothering dimension. Charles pushes for high church Anglicanism, which the Puritans think is the light beer version of Catholicism. They worry that the king's religious revanchism will take England back to the dark days before Henry VIII's break with Rome. And Scotland's got a say in this too. The Scots are ready to riot if Charles even tries to introduce the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which naturally he does. History is replete with examples illustrating the popularity of religious imposition. This tension explodes into war in 1642. It's king versus parliament, cavaliers versus roundheads. The war rages across three separate conflicts. The royalists start strong, but Parliament, with the organizational skills of Oliver Cromwell, gradually gains the upper hand. Cromwell forms the New Model Army, disciplined, well-trained, and perhaps a little too eager to win. By 1649, that Roundhead pluckiness pulls through. Charles is captured, tried for treason, and, in a historic first, executed in front of his people. England becomes a republic under Cromwell, who, though he has dethroned a king, quickly sets himself up as Lord Protector, and rules in a style that feels suspiciously like, well, a monarchy with less fabulous clothes. After a brief experiment with republicanism, England restores the monarchy in 1660 with Charles II, but the whole affair has fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Monarchy is more chastened, less absolute. Parliament is in the ascendancy, and by 1689 it will establish a constitutional monarchy. So, as you can see, the poets we'll look at today come from a very particular social and political faction. And as Western history has played out over the centuries, it's a faction not in favor with the advocates of the Enlightenment-style liberal democracy that characterizes our own time. Critic Geoffrey Walton, in an essay on the Cavalier Poets, grumbles that our society, quote, encompasses a cult of dreariness, and that, quote, personal elegance and courteous behavior seem not to be conspicuously fashionable. And I thought I was a grumpy dinosaur. And granted, he is writing in the throes of last century's counterculture, during which a pointed lack of hygiene marked the hippie as liberated from the constraints of decent-smelling society. But I do think he overshoots the mark. We're as obsessed with fashionable clothing and behavior as any affluent society. We've merely replaced the past's aristocratic culture with our own celebrity and influencer culture. But so far as our aristos spring from democratic soil, Walton's point that the world presented by the Cavaliers is quite foreign to our own feels pretty valid. There seems to us a somewhat closed world in which a good life, which is really the only philosophical exploration these writers undertake, and they define it by individual freedom and pleasure, companionship with like-minded people, and a conservative nostalgia, this good life is the purpose of human existence, and we may detect a strain of privileged hedonism in their outlook. But while they may have preferred light verse about flowers, drinking, and sex, these poets were not unlearned. Indeed, an ostentatious indulgence in classical allusion is one of the more obvious hallmarks of their style. The Cavalier Poets shared the twin influences of John Donne and his metaphysical poetry and Ben Jonson's moralism. Indeed, many of the writers we'll look at today belonged to a club called the Sons of Ben, which would meet at various London taverns to preen and debate and drink. Walton says, quote, Cavalier poetry presents a surprising mixture of elegance and sophistication with naivety and schoolboy obscenity. So let's begin with perhaps the most well-known Cavalier poem. It was always quite a crowd pleaser, but it became part of our popular culture and has remained so for decades, following the 1989 film Dead Poets Society, which uses the poem as its thesis. It's called To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, and it's by Robert Herrick. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best, which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent, the worse and worse times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may, go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Loyal listeners may remember that we looked at Herrick's poem The Hag for one of our Halloween subcast episodes. To the Virgins, though, is one of many poems from the era to invoke the Carpe Diem theme, usually translated, as in Dead Poets Society, as Seize the Day. Carpe Diem comes from Book 1 of Roman poet Horace's Odes. It's number 11, by the way, and the key phrase is probably better translated as Pluck the Day, because in Ode 11, Horace is creating a winemaking metaphor. But the upshot's the same. Carpe diem quam minimum credula postero. Pluck the day, trusting as little as possible to the future. So, go live life, be present. Go skydiving, Rocky Mountain climbing, spend 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu. Live in the now. This is the message that dominates today's advertising and guidance counselors' offices. It's the wisdom of our age because it essentially means to us, consume, go get stuff. Herrick's version seems a perfectly pleasant exhortation to virgins who have not yet fully experienced life to rush out and pluck rosebuds, which means lovers, right? Okay. Do so while you're young and beautiful. Who's gonna want your flowers when they're old and wilted? All right. It's a bit sexist, because nobody here thinks he's talking to young, inexperienced men, right? And wouldn't matter anyway. Male virgins would be in their parents' basement playing whatever the 17th century equivalent to video games was. Right, so leans a little too much on a woman's worth residing in her looks, but then the whole vibe here is of breathless rapture. All worth resides in beauty and sensual pleasure. Here is a celebration of the transitory, the ephemeral, the superficial. We've no time for depth and reflection. The sun's a setting. Let's get it on. Herrick hits these themes again in Corinna's Gone A-Maying. Maying, by the way, is celebrating May Day, the rebirth of spring, by dancing and gathering flowers, fertility ritual stuff. I'll only quote the last stanza here because it's a somewhat longer poem and, well, you'll get the point. Come, let us go while we are in our prime, and take the harmless folly of the time. We shall grow old apace and die before we know our liberty. Our life is short, and our days run as fast away as does the sun. And as a vapor or a drop of rain once lost can ne'er be found again, so when or you or I are made a fable, song, or fleeting shade, all love, all liking, all delight lies drowned with us in endless night. Then, while time serves and we are but decaying, come, my Corinna, come, let's go a-maying. Here, Liberty is almost defined as harmless folly. Herrick offers a more interesting stanza form in Corinna than in To the Virgins, alternating pentameter couplets with tetrameter quatrains, and the earlier stanzas are strewn with allusions to Titan and Flora and Aurora. Some of the rhymes offer quite interesting juxtapositions, prime and time, decaying and amaying. I wonder about die and liberty, though. Maybe in the original pronunciation they were a more perfect rhyme, but now we would certainly read them as two different sounds, as half rhyme, which provides a provocative contrast between death and freedom. Thomas Carrie, the name looks like Carew, but's pronounced Carrie. He gives us a thoughtful variation on the Carpe Diem trope in a poem called variously He That Loves a Rosy Cheek or Disdain Returned. I learned it under the former title, so perhaps that has influenced my reading. We'll see. Here's the poem. He that loves a rosy cheek or a coral lip admires, or from star-like eyes doth seek fuel to maintain his fires. As old time makes these decay, so his flames must waste away. But a smooth and steadfast mind, gentle thoughts and calm desires, hearts with equal love combined kindle never-dying fires. Where these are not, I despise lovely cheeks or lips or eyes. No tears, Celia, now shall win my resolved heart to return. I have searched thy soul within and find naught but pride and scorn. I have learned thy arts, and now can disdain as much as thou. Some power in my revenge convey that love to her I cast away. The poem opens as an admonition against the frivolity of the Carpe Diem lover. One whose tastes are as superficial as fleeting beauty must be superficial and fleeting as well. I hear slight echoes of Shakespeare's satirical Sonnet 130. You remember that one, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun? And I can't help but think that Carrie had it in mind. The second stanza reminds me of John Donne and his valediction forbidding mourning, with its emphasis on spiritual and emotional bonds over the mere temptations of physical beauty. The Cavaliers in general were very much influenced by Donne, and many penned elegies for the dear doctor. Carrie's final stanza, though, seems almost bilious, doesn't it? Condemning Celia's scornful pride. But then it ends in ambivalence, for he begs that some power carry his love to her despite his repudiation. This one's got a little more complexity going on. I like it. He offers another counterpoint in a poem called The Spring. Now that the winter's gone, the earth hath lost her snow-white robes, and now no more the frost candies the grass, or casts an icy cream upon the silver lake or crystal stream. But the warm sun thaws the benumbed earth, and makes it tender, gives a sacred birth to the dead swallow, wakes in hollow tree the drowsy cuckoo and the humble bee. Now do a choir of chirping minstrels bring in triumph to the world the youthful spring. The valleys, hills, and woods in rich array welcome the coming of the longed-for May. Now all things smile, only my love doth lower, nor hath the scalding noonday sun the power to melt that marble ice, which still doth hold her heart congealed, and makes her pity cold. The ox, which lately did for shelter fly into the stall, doth now securely lie in open fields, and love no more is made by the fireside, but in the cooler shade a mantis now doth with his chloris sleep under a sycamore, and all things keep time with the season. Only she doth carry June in her eyes, in her heart January. In this pastoral, in the reverdy tradition, that is the regreening tradition, poems about the return of spring, a lonely speaker regards Chloris, a spring goddess, reclining in the shade of a sycamore with her shepherd lover Amantis. The speaker feels even more lovelorn in this environment of bursting fertility and lushness. This guy is not going a-maying. He's not gathering any rosebuds. I wonder if he takes some little comfort in Chloris's deception, the June in her eyes, the January in her heart. The Cavalier poet par excellence, Richard Lovelace, addresses a poem to Chloris as well. It's called Love Made in the First Age. It's an almost elegiac poem, lamenting the passing of that first golden age when women, never said no. Free love, baby, no rules. Let's go to Woodstock, man. He says, quote, "Thrice happy was that golden age when compliment was construed rage, and fine words in the center hid, when cursed no stained no maid's bliss, and all discourse was summed in yes, and naught forbade but to forbid." The poem goes on to catalog all the groovy things you could eat and do in the good old days. Young men could, quote, "indifferently crop a flower and a maidenhead." Very courteous of Mr. Loveless to gloss that complex metaphor for us.
Why, thank you.
These indifferent lads could eat cherries, roses, plums. Loveless doesn't gloss these, but perhaps he reckons you get the gist. And they can drink, quote, "wine from the bunch, milk from the nipple." In this world, there is no power, no restrictions. Even sex is chaste. No deception. All is innocence. I really do think of this poem as almost like a proto-manifesto for 1960s counterculture at its most earnest and idealistic. The idea that shame and guilt are imposed by society upon our natural innocence has I guess it's kind of a sad sort of naivety to it. And as I said in passing, Lovelace may be the epitome of the Cavalier poet. Dashing and handsome, he personified the sprezzatura of the ideal courtier poet, much like Sir Philip Sidney before him. He can produce a powerful and lush eroticism at the same time maintaining an insouciance and poise. His most anthologized poem is certainly To Lucasta Going to the Wars. Quote, "Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast and quiet mind to war and arms I fly. True, a new mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as you too shall adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more." In 3 fleeting quatrains, a cavalier remonstrates with his lover Lucasta for putting herself above his honor. He calls the military enemy his new mistress, thus confusedly reckoning his abandonment of Lucasta as the honorable thing to do. He explicitly says he will be more faithful to his sword, horse, and shield, and that she should adore his inconstancy because he could not love her as much as he does if he didn't love honor more. Quintessential Cavalier poem, luxurious, masculinist, and casual. His To Althea from Prison, written during his stay at the Gatehouse prison because he was advocating against a recent law that cut clergy off from the exercise of political authority, this one again dwells upon the speaker's fortitude in suffering for the king and the paradoxical nature of liberty and honor despite physical imprisonment. The enlarged winds and tippling fish and birds, or gods depending on the version, Those frolicking in the air do not know such liberty as the imprisoned man of honor. Here's his last stanza. Opens with a quite famous line. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds innocent and quiet take that for a hermitage. If I have freedom in my love, and in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty. Stirring stuff, I imagine. The kind of stuff that requires the crescendo of a swelling orchestra as the speaker stands in his cell, bestrides his dungeon, arms akimbo as he stares into the imagined horizon. Maybe I'm too cynical about aristocratic honor to be inspired by such sentiments. I hardly believe that any peasant foot soldier can afford to scribble rhymes celebrating the captaincy of his soul. He's too busy getting run down by charging cavaliers. Let's wrap up with a couple of items from Sir John Suckling, whose name I am still immature enough to giggle at occasionally. Here's a poem called A Soldier, and it's as good a representative sample of the Cavalier outlook as any of the poems we've read through today. Quote, I am a man of war and might, and know thus much, that I can fight whether I am either wrong or right devoutly. No woman under heaven I fear, new oaths I can exactly swear, and 40 healths my brain will bear most stoutly. I cannot speak, but I can do as much as any of our crew, and if you doubt it, some of you may prove me. I dare be bold thus much to say, if that my bullets do but play, you would be hurt so night and day, yet love me. It's pretty easy to see in this poem a performance of the bluster and bravado of the Cavalier persona. It's aggressive and combative. If other poets of this school, like Carrie, show their debt to John Donne, I think Suckling definitely owes Ben Jonson some props here. Because I can't help but thinking that Suckling's kind of taken the mickey. It feels too Cavalier, doesn't it? Too, hurrah, boys, and over the top. Last one in Mrs. Cromwell's bedchamber's a rotten egg. Whoa-hey! One can read a schoolboy's naughty subtext in it, drinking and seduction and ejaculation. But as it draws the comparison between martial and sexual conquests, it explicitly mocks the honor and integrity of the latter, that is, the false oaths the speaker swears to get the woman vertical. And so, if consistent, it must also at least question the honor of the former, which was so insisted upon by Loveless. If we look at Suckling's most famous poem, again the name varies, Constancy or The Constant Lover, I think we're more apt to accept Suckling's ability to store his tongue securely in his cheek. Here it is. Out upon it, I have loved 3 whole days together, and I am like to love 3 more, if it prove fair weather. Time shall molt away his wings, ere he shall discover in the whole wide world again such a constant lover. But the spite on it is, no praise is due at all to me. Love with me had made no stays, had it any been but she. Had it any been but she, and that very face, there had been at least ere this a dozen in her place. The irony here is as subtle as a neon sledgehammer to the Danglies. Of course, these 3 days have been the longest love affair of this man's life, so he's some credibility. But again, Suckling mocks the idea of constancy, fidelity, even loyalty. It's worth noting that Suckling was accused of treason in 1641, following which he fled England and may very well have taken his own life in 1642. I realize I'm implying an egregious leap of reasoning here, but In so insular a community as the Cavaliers were, the relentless insistence upon the values that define the community, like the swelling violins in a puritanical dungeon, they amplify and intensify. See, the absence of a counterbalancing perspective makes, religious groups more prone to fanaticism. It makes political groups more vulnerable to radicalism. I'm sure we all know a perfectly pleasant man who becomes a laddish lout when out with the guys. There's almost a need to prove our purity, the strength of our commitment, to ensure our worthiness to the group. I read Suckling's poems, and I admit, perhaps perfectly idiosyncratically. I don't know anything about his intentions or his beliefs or anything. But I see his work as at once the ridiculous extreme of the Cavalier persona and its plausibly deniable critic. There are so many other writers I could have looked at today. There's James Shirley, who gave us our most recent Halloween poem, Death the Leveler. And there's Edmund Waller. Abraham Crowley, who some consider the greatest heir of Dr. Donne. Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan. It's worth reading around a bit. You'll see subtle differences between them, and the poetry, if not ponderous, is not taxing. It's pleasant and often light. But on the other hand, so much of their poetry is in a similar vein, which, in a format like a survey podcast, would just come across to the listener as redundant. So I opted for a few key notions: elegance, luxury, courtesy, insouciance, honor, and masculinity. I think that should give a broad framework for your individual explorations, should you care to do so. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Classic English Literature Podcast. If you have, please take a moment to let your friends and family know about it. I'd like to have as many people join us as possible. The more the merrier, as they say. Remember to subscribe to the show so you don't miss any episodes. And don't forget the Support the Show button if you value the work here enough to help support it. Thanks for all you do. And until next time, Carpe that Diem.